Hey everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we continue our series on the quick Rui, which is of course not very quick at all. We're up to episode 31, and initially I had intended to cover the Chigorin as well as some sidelines, but what I'm going to do instead is cover some more sidelines and minor black ninth moves in response to H3. So quite a bit to go. I suppose next time we'll do the Chigorin, then the Zaitsev, and then the Breyer. At least that's the plan at the moment. So here we go. We've seen all of these moves a bunch of times now. And okay, the position we're going to focus on is from here after H3. But we've got a few things to look at before we get there. And, and then of course we have some positions to look at once we are there. So let's go back to here. And one thing I want to mention, well, okay, actually before I hit that, sorry, I'll do two sidelines here. Then I'm going to discuss the Gajewski Gambit. Then we'll look at this kind of neo-Gajewski Gambit. And then we'll talk about the ninth move sidelines. Black's ninth move sidelines. So first of all, of course, the Spanish bishop on b3 is a very, very well-placed piece. And you may recall from some of the anti-martials that white plays a4. Well, actually, white plays a4 in quite a few variations of the Rui. And among other things, doing so allows the bishop, if it's kicked, for instance, by knight to a5, to stay on the a2, g8 diagonal. So one interesting move that you probably haven't seen before, at least I'm guessing, is a3. And here can suggest a couple of ideas for black. So one is to play bishop to e6. Now this is sometimes played after h3, and it makes sense here as well. Especially since white can't play a takes b3. So I think ab is the better way to recapture in that variation with h3, bishop b6, d4. So here it's not available, and a3 is not really the most useful move in the world. So after queen to b8, which is kind of standard with the idea of playing queen to b6, it seems like black is doing all right. So this is one decent way to play. Another decent way is just to kick with knight a5, bishop a2, and then play c5 with the idea of closing down shop for the bishop with c5, c4. So white generally plays b4 here, kicking the knight back, knight c6, and now d3. But this is not really the most dynamic approach for white, and with this queenside pawn structure with pawns on a3, b4, c3, and so on, it's a little bit more difficult for white to engage in the traditional kingside build-up in peace. And I think with a well-timed a6 to a5, black will be in pretty good shape. So I think a3, while interesting, is not really all that worrisome for black. Another idea is to play d3, certainly a move we've discussed before. In positions like this, bishop to g4 is not really a big deal. In case of bishop to g4, then white just does his usual thing, so the knight comes to d2. Alright, let's say black plays some kind of Chigorin style plan with knight a5 and c5. Okay, so now knight f1. Let's say the knight comes back to c6. Well, now you can either play knight e3 or h3, bishop h5, and knight to g3. And the bishop's really not brilliantly placed on g6. White plays knight h4 with the idea of putting knights on f5. Not really to take on g6, but to play sooner or later the knight to f5. So for instance here, let's say d4, knight h to f5 for instance, and white is doing well. So this is at least one possible continuation. Okay, so instead of that, knight a5, bishop c2, c5, knight b to d2, rook e8, knight f1, bishop to b7. Actually here black has played a lot of moves. Bishop to b7, well, okay, we'll come back to that. There are three other moves that are at least as common. Knight c6, but they're all pretty standard Rui Lopez moves for black. Bishop f8 with the stock idea of g6, bishop g7, and so on. And also h6, which keeps white minor pieces off of g5. For instance, after bishop f8, it's at least conceivable that white could consider bishop to g5. In fact, this is one of the main lines. And the idea is simply to take on f6 and put the knight on e3, and then try to conquer the d5 square. So bishop, well, okay, for example, h6. Bishop h4 is also quite normal, but let's say bishop f6, queen f6, knight e3, hitting the d5 square, bishop to e6, and now a3, planning to play b4, drive the knight back and play bishop to b3, and then control the d5 square. So this idea of swapping off white's dark squared bishop for a knight, and ultimately trying to leave black with nothing but, at least in among his minor pieces, nothing but that bishop on f8, which is obviously powerful or powerless to contest d5. That's a pretty decent outcome for white. All right, so I mentioned knight c6 from here, bishop f8 from here, and h6. Bishop to b7 is a logical move too, though. All right, a4, knight c6, and here again, white's got several moves. He could play knight e3, could play knight to g3, and there's also that same approach that we just discussed, bishop to g5. Maybe it's a little bit better when the bishop is back on f8, but okay, h6, takes, knight e3. I think black is a little bit better set up to fight for the d5 square this time around, and the bishop is more active on f6 slightly than it is on f8. So probably black should equalize, but it's not a bad plan, and certainly at a club level I think this can be an effective plan. Okay, so back to here. So we talked about a3 and d3. d3 being really the richer of the two moves. There's a lot that can be said about that. Anyway, h3. Now, the moves we'll discuss in the future are, well, we'll get to the Zaitsev with bishop to b7, but let's come back to that later. Let's get to knight a5. And this is going to be the subject of our examinations next time around. But we're going to look at one sideline in this now. Bishop to c2, and now rather than c5, which is the main move, and then we'll look at d4 and d3 from here. Okay, so instead of these moves, we will right now look at d5. And this is a kind of surprising idea, funny little gambit that was discovered or invented, however you want to look at it, by the Polish Grandmaster Gajewski. And he played this first in 2007. And since then there have been hundreds and hundreds of games on this, lots of theoretical investigations. And it's not clear still if white can gain an advantage against it, although I think probably white's chances of an edge against this are better than they are against the main lines. But that said, it's very lively and entirely playable for black. All right, so we'll look at three moves quickly here for white. So there's e takes d5, there's d3, and then we'll look a little bit more carefully at d4. So e takes d5 is another main line. So let's start with d3. And I'll just mention that d3 is kind of a safe, slow way to play the position. It prevents black from having this kind of lively gambit play. So it may or may not be the most incisive approach, but it might be the one that's least pleasant for black, given at least what we might suppose is his temperament, given that he's playing this gambit line in the first place. All right, but that's psychology rather than trying to refute the gambit. Okay, so e takes d5 is one of the two major moves. Now e4, bishop takes, knight takes, rook takes, bishop to b7, d4, rook e8. Sometimes white just brings the rook straight back, but okay, bishop to f4 is, I think, a little bit more common. Knight c4 hitting the b pawn, b3, knight b6. And black's results have been very good here. I think he scored 50% against all of white's tries. White's queenside structure looks a bit lumpy, really, and pushing those pawns will just ultimately weaken the pawn on d4. So I think between black's bishop pair and white's lack of coordination, really, I think black is just fine here. So if this is the best white can do after e takes d5, then I think e takes d5 isn't really the way to go. So let's discuss d4 then, the other main move. So white's going to try to open the center and hope to show that black's knight on a5 is misplaced. So d takes e4, knight e5, c5. And here white's tried a bunch of moves. Bishop to e3 is the most popular choice. Bishop to g5 is second most popular, but not very successful. White's results with that move have not been very good. Knight to d2 is a pretty distant third choice. And then there's the fairly rare bishop to f4, which is what we're going to look at. This was introduced in, I think, 2009 by Wang Hao, the strong Chinese grandmaster who, in fact, just won the Beal tournament in 2012. And this move was also Houdini's recommendation. The idea is to play d takes c5. All right, so how does this work? Well, 3 tries for black here. In some earlier games, black played cd. In fact, I think both of Wang Hao's games saw this. So cd, cd, bishop b7, knight c3, rook c8, knight takes e4. And here, black should be careful how he recaptures. In the later game, black played knight takes e4. And after all of these exchanges, and then queen f3, white was basically up a pawn for nothing. And after rook c2, which was another mistake, bishop h6, black was already losing here. So it's better to play bishop takes e4, and then not, of course, make the second capture, which would transpose, but to play first bishop to b4, and now takes, and now queen d5. All right, here Michalewski recommends or suggests a couple of possibilities. Well, one is the game for a while, and the other is Michalewski. So queen f3 he thinks is interesting, f6, knight d3, knight c6, a3, bishop a5, and bishop e3. And white is a little bit better. Or to put it a little bit differently, black has pretty decent compensation for the pawn, but not enough for the pawn, at least not full compensation for the pawn. Okay, instead the game, Wang Hao against Liang Chong went like this: rook e3, rook f to d8, queen g4, f6, knight f3, knight c4, rook e2. And here, white's slightly better, although I believe he did go on to lose this game. Unfortunately for the sake of his novelty, but nevertheless, from a theoretical standpoint, it was a success. Okay, so perhaps because of the theoretical success that Wang Hao achieved with this and his win in the second game, players have tried other moves. Michalewski recommends bishop to e6, which may not have been tested. And then there's also bishop to b7, which is a very risky try. It's very, very risky and interesting, but might be all right. So here's how this goes. So d takes c5, bishop c5. Well, okay, if knight to d5, then Michalewski suggests the following: c6, knight c6, bishop e4, knight f4, bishop c6, takes, bishop c5. And now with a4, it seems that white can perhaps maintain an edge here. Okay, back to this position here. So bishop to b7, d takes c5, and then the main line is bishop takes c5. And this entails a piece sacrifice, but it seems that black gets a lot of play for it. So it can either go like this: b4, knight to d5, bishop g3, takes. And we'll see this position again in a moment, but through a different move order. So queen takes, rook takes, b4, knight d5, and now, okay, if bishop g3, we have this, and it looks like black is really taking over the initiative at this point. So the better way is for white to not play that way, but to play g3. Okay, so knight f4, gf4, f6, knight g4, f5, knight to h2. Obviously, if you go to e3, then you can just trade off. So, yeah, and actually knight e5 might be interesting, though. So I have to figure out why not knight e5. But anyway, knight h2, bishop d6, ba, and then bishop f4. So maybe knight e5 should be investigated there. At any rate, black's only got one pawn for the piece here, but he does have a pretty nice initiative. White's pieces are clearly not well posted. Most of them are undeveloped or barely developed, and all 5 of his pawns are isolated as well. So this is, in fact, quite an interesting line. As I said, maybe the best thing to do about this, unless you really undertake a very, very careful investigation, is to play d3. Well, but don't forget, after d4, there are also several other moves. So, I mean, from this position, here. There's also bishop g5, bishop e3, and knight to d2. Although, as I said, bishop to e3 hasn't done especially well. But the other two moves have been okay. All right, so now we're going to go back all the way to here and discuss a brand new version of this Gajewski gambit, also invented by Gajewski. So c3, inviting the marshal, but here, knight to a5. So this is still another version of this. Well, the difference here, well, there are a few differences, but white hasn't played h3, and black hasn't pushed his d pawn yet. So who this favors, time will tell. Anyway, from here, we'll look at two moves. Knight takes e5, which has been played, but only in pretty low-level games. So one possible continuation is for black to grab the bishop here, and after d3 to play either c5, with the idea of playing c4, undermining the e4 pawn, or playing d5, just blasting the position open for his light square bishop in particular. And in both cases, black has some initiative for the pawn. So the main move here is bishop to c2. All right, d5, and now, of course, it's the same thing. The only question is white benefiting from the pawn not being on h3 or not? All right, so maybe the d3 idea will be possible here too. Again, trying to just kind of cool black's jets and make him play sleepy chess. Anyway, we'll look at d4 and e takes d5. So on d4, ed, e5, knight e4, cd, f5, takes, knight c3, takes, bishop g4, and this pin could be annoying, but white can break it. Queen d3, g6, and okay, in the game Soledov-Nishenko against Gajewski, played in the Netherlands in 2012, earlier this year as of this recording, white played bishop to h6. After takes, and bishop g7, black was doing fine, and I think he won the game. Instead, maybe knight to e5 is better, but black still has decent chances for equality. All right. Instead of d4, then, there's also e takes d5, and we've already seen essentially this. So e4, takes, bishop b7, and, okay, the pawn not being on h3 doesn't seem to make such a big deal, and it looks like black is doing quite well here. So d3, we'll look at a different approach this time. Bishop takes, rook e1, queen d6, knight d2, and now f5, taking the e4 square away from the white knight, and it looks like black is doing well. Only the knight on a5 is kind of misplaced, but it's not that big of a deal. And after a4, black could play b4, but just knight c6 is fine, bringing the knight back into the game. So takes. C4 was played in Cotronius against Halkias in Achaia earlier in this year, 2012. But I think Michalewski, I'm not sure, I think it's Michalewski, recommends queen e2. Actually, maybe it's me and the computer, I'm not positive at this point. Anyway, queen e2, bishop f6, d4, rook b8, knight f1. I think this was Michalewski's commentary, and thinks that white has an edge here. Although, again, that nice light square bishop that black enjoys does give him good chances. Not so much to win, but as in the Marshall Gambit, to have various blockading possibilities. So black has good draw compensation, I think, more than three results compensation. But I might be wrong about that. Anyway, I believe that's just about all I want to say about sidelines, but we still have quite a bit to discuss on move 9. So back to bishop to b3. So instead of castling, we'll go back to d6, c3 castles, and again, not a3 and d3, but h3. And now, just to give a quick overview of everything here. All right, so knight a5, again, we'll discuss next time in this position with d4 or d3. Okay, so that's the Chigorin. Knight to b8 is the Breyer. This will be our final show. And our penultimate show will be on the Zaitsev with bishop to b7. And that generally continues d4, rook e8, and so on. Not fearing knight to g5 because the rook can just go back to f8. And the reason why I point this out is that there are a bunch of lines we're going to look at tonight or today, depending on where you are, where, in fact, black used to be really worried about that, but now no one cares. So let's look at some of the other options. So rook e8, d4, bishop to b7 is another way of getting to the Zaitsev. But now let's discuss the alternatives. So now, one more variation that's not going to transpose to a Zaitsev is knight to d7. And this is a bit of a funny-looking move, at least compared to the big three. So rather than clearing d7 for the other knight, as in the Briar, or worrying about queenside expansion in the Chigorin, or well, the Zaitsev kind of goes in its own direction. Black plays this funny-looking move. What's the idea? Well, one part of the plan is to put the bishop on f6. Now, many of you surely know that in the Rui, black often plays rook to e8, the bishop goes to f8, he plays g6, and puts the bishop on g7. Well, why not just put it on f6 more quickly? So instead of that whole long maneuver, and plus g6 kind of weakens the king side, if you just play the bishop to f6 straight away, you're keeping an eye on g5 while still putting the bishop, roughly speaking, on that diagonal. The knight from d7 can go to c5, maybe from there it goes to e6, or maybe it's just good where it is. And the other knight can go to e7 if need be. All right, by the way, the name of this, I mean, it's had a bunch of names. I think Kara is one person whose name has been attached to this. Ems and some other people call it, name it for Karpov. Okay, I don't know that really Karpov deserves it, but he did play it in some World Championship games. So he certainly did something to popularize it, but whether he deserves the label, I don't know. Anyway, let's have a look. So d4 is the standard move. Bishop f6, a4, bishop to b7. And now two important moves for white that we'll look at. Knight a3, pressuring the b5 pawn, kind of like the Neo-Archangelsk variation. And d5. And I should say that in the closed Rui, d5 is often not a bad way to go when black has played bishop to b7. So if you play d4, black puts bishop on b7, often, not always, but often d5 is a decent idea, as the bishop will then later have to waste time going back to c8 and trying to get back into the game over there. All right, well, let's look at each. So knight a3, ed, cd, rook e8. Okay, and here white cannot take twice on b5 just yet because the rook on a1 is hanging. So after bishop to f4, now white does threaten to capture twice on b5. So knight a5, bishop c2, b4, knight b1. And now a couple of moves for black, and both seem to be pretty okay. One is to play c5, so immediately pressuring the white center and trying to extend the diagonal for the bishop on f6. So knight b to d2, knight f8, e5, or dc and then e5. Of course, that transposes to the exact same thing. So e5 takes, bishop e7, queen e2, and knight e6. And it seems that black is probably equal here. I mean, both sides have their trumps. White's light squared bishop looks very good, but it's hard for the white pieces to really build an attack just with that bishop alone. For instance, the queen can't get to e4. If it goes to d3, it gets traded off. Knight to g5 is not going to be possible anytime soon. So it looks like black is okay. Alternatively, black could play knight f8, and then knight e6. And now c5. Okay, so white plays d5 here, and now the knight does some more rerouting, goes to f8, and from there it'll go to g6 or d7, from where it may eventually end up on e5. But also there's a threat on the diagonal to the pawn on b2. So rook to b1, c4, and here white has done okay, playing both b3. Well, black threatens to win the bishop with b3 himself. So white either plays b3 here or queen e2. And white has done okay in both cases, but it looks like the position is equal. So those games were all pretty old, something like they were all played about a decade or more ago. And it looks like now, I mean, with a little bit of computer work, black should be pretty okay. Okay, so knight to a3, back from here, from this position, doesn't seem to me to give an advantage. So d5 is the main line, and now the knight goes to e7. So that's another virtue of the bishop going to f6. Okay, and now two moves we'll look at here. Well, I'll just mention that bishop to c2 has a good score, and it has Houdini, the computer engine's blessing. But a takes b5, I think, is the main line here. So ab, rook a8, queen a8, knight a3, bishop a6. And here, whether white has an objective advantage or not, I'm not sure. But he's done well with any of three moves. So there's bishop to e3, which is aimed against knight to c5. There's knight to h2, preparing kingside play with knight to g4. And finally, there's knight to c2, with the idea of blockading, putting the knight on the good blockading square b4. The problem for black here is that his b5 pawn is a little bit loose, and the c7 pawn is not great either. If he plays c6, then the d6 pawn can be a little bit weak. Plus, it reopens the diagonal for the bishop on b3. So it looks like a position that's easier for white to play. But whether, again, it's anything objectively, whether his advantage is an objective one that can be quantifiably proven, I don't know about that. But it looks easier for me to play white. Okay, so that's all I want to say about knight to d7. It's certainly not exhaustive coverage, but it's enough to give you some decent sense of what the sides are up to and where some of the important variations are. Okay, next up is h6, and this is Smyslov's variation, and it's closely related to the Zaitsev, but was supplanted by it when it was realized that black didn't really have to worry about knight to g5 in response to rook e8. Well, it doesn't have to worry about it, at least as long as black doesn't mind a draw. So if white wants to draw, then he can just go back and forth, g5, f3, and so on. But that aside. All right, so after h6, d4, rook e8, knight b to d2, bishop f8. And black is going to just play to pressure the e-pawn. So he's going to put the bishop on b7, and then, depending on what white does, either play ed and knight a5, or knight a5 right away, or if white's played bishop to c2, can trade and play knight b4. In fact, that can transpose to a Zaitsev. Anyway, from here, white has several plans, but I'll mention two. So one lesser-known plan, but that's been used by players as prestigious as Peter Svidler and Alexander Morozevich in the last couple of years, is this plan that's very similar to what was at one point considered almost a refutation of the Breyer, this idea. So bishop c2, d5, b3, and then c4. So white constructs this pawn chain, not allowing black to create any pawn imbalances here, not allowing him to create any majorities. And all right, it's just a possible plan. I don't know that black is officially worse, but it's an interesting way for white to go. All right, another way is the more traditional knight f1. Bishop b7, knight to g3, knight a5. And I should say that because black has played h6 more quickly, white had time to bring the knight all the way around to g3 first. In the Zaitsev, white will not have time to do that. So that's an important difference. So if, for instance, white had played something like a4 here, then we would transpose to a Zaitsev after bishop to b7. But, yeah, so white gets to swing the knight around to g3 first, making sure that his e4 pawn stays secure. Okay, and I should point out that here, if black plays ed and then takes on e4, the point is that white has bishop to d5 and or queen to c2, which will pick up a piece. So bishop b7, knight g3, knight a5, knight c4, and a4. Okay, so this is black's made an awful lot of bishop or knight moves, and the knight's still not fantastic on a4. All right, so black's got two ideas here. He can play b takes a4, which is probably both the most popular and the sounder approach, but I think white has a simple edge here. After a5 to stop white from playing a5, then bishop to d3, and with this little bit of extra space and the potentially useful outpost on b5, I think white stands slightly better. So it might be better, maybe, to play d5. And it's certainly a sharper approach. So a b, trades here, knight e5, de, knight h5. Takes, and then rook e7. And I think this might have happened in a game too. I think black even ended up winning it. But at this point, white has maybe a very small pull. So this is playable. You know, it's I think in general white has pretty good chances for an edge against the Smyslov move here, this h6 idea. All right. Next thing I want to discuss is bishop to e6, and I have no idea what this thing is called. I've never seen a name of it. I'm sure it's got one somewhere, whether it's well established or not. Anyway, the idea is pretty obvious. Black wants to trade off white's excellent Spanish bishop. And it's not considered terribly dangerous from black's point of view for white to take on e6. It's felt that black can use the f-file, and also the pawn on e6 is useful in potentially keeping white pieces out of d5 and f5. So white plays d4, black takes, since white was threatening to fork with d5. And now both queen b3 and a b3 have been played quite a bit. But I think after queen takes b3, as long as black plays queen to d7, I think he's in good shape here. d5 is played quite a bit too, but this I don't think is as good. So after ed, knight a5, queen c2, ed4, otherwise he's losing the pawn, cd, knight d5, knight c3. I think white has a pretty nice position here. He's got an isolated pawn, and you might think, well, he's got an isolated pawn and no real kingside attacking prospect, so that's got to favor black, right? Well, the problem here for black is, thanks to the pawns on a6 and b5, and not having a light square bishop either, black is really pretty sore. Is going to be kind of vulnerable to white poking around on the c-file. So c6 might be an outpost someday for white. The c7 pawn is going to be attacked pretty easily. Conceivably, even the c5 square could come under white's control with something like knight e4 and knight c5 if black doesn't exchange. So I think white stands better here. And so if you see queen takes b3 and you play this with black, play queen d7. Well, I think queen d7 is good, so I would recommend a takes b3 instead. And now after ed, cd, knight to b4 is sometimes played, but I think white stands better after d5. White is going to potentially use the d4 square. I mean, a knight going to d4 would be very nice. And the knight on b4 doesn't look terribly secure or brilliant. So d5 I think is the better choice. e5, knight e4, knight c3. And here black chooses between bishop to b4 and f5. And I think in every case, though, white's going to gain an edge. So after bishop to b4, white can either play just the straightforward, perfectly sound and good queen to d3, again with an edge, or white can go rolling the dice with knight to e4. So bishop e1, knight e to g5, and the idea is that after bishop to b4, queen c2 just wins on the spot, because white threatens mate, but also the knight on c6. Black must therefore play h6, taking the knight right away. Queen c2 takes, and here in practice I think white has played knight takes g5, and this is also good for some edge. g6, queen c6, bishop b4. But black is going to play bishop to e7 shortly, and most of the time white has decided that retreating the knight back to f3 when that happens is a better idea than h4. Well, if that's the case, then why bother playing knight takes g5 in the first place? So queen c6, bishop b4, now bishop takes g5. And here too I think white is slightly better, but maybe it's bigger slightly better. So right now black is up the exchange for one pawn, but a6, d5, and c7 are all weak. And for that matter, if a6 drops, b5 is going to be weak too. So I think white is certainly for choice here. All right, so going back to this position, if bishop to b4 doesn't equalize, well, how about f5? This, I think, won't equalize either. E takes f6, and now if bishop takes, then knight e4 and queen d5. And here, white probably maintains an edge with either rook to g4 or rook f4. But black does have fair chances to hold. Again, the compensation is not Three result compensation. Black is never going to win. Well, okay, I can't say black is never going to win this. Black should not win this, especially I think after rook to g4. But the pressure on d4, the queen being very nicely situated on d5, and for that matter, the weakness of white's b pawns, especially the guy on b3, certainly give black something to hope for, definitely in terms of just holding the position securely. On the other hand, white's got, all right, probably not really anything serious on the king side. I mean, obviously not right now, but not anytime soon either. But there could be pressure on the c file, and the a pawn is at least something that's going to require black to spend some attention on. So maybe between that and hopes of using the king side, white still has real winning chances here. All right. The other way to go is with knight takes f6. All right, on this, bishop g5, b4, knight a4. The idea here is to take on f6 potentially, or play rook c1, maybe take on f6. Yeah, probably bishop f6 first, then if rook f6, then rook c1 and knight c5. If bishop takes, knight c5 immediately. Anyway, so knight e4 keeps, or at least tries to keep white off of c5. But bishop takes, and knight c5 anyway. So giving up the pressure on the c file in order to gain the d4 square. And white is better here too. All in all then, I think that bishop to e6 is not really an equalizer, but it's not a terrible move. And if you're researching and you like the positions, by all means play it. I mean, you're not going to be clearly worse, just at most, I think, slightly worse. Okay, next on the hit parade is a5. And this is a really funny looking move, but it's in fact kind of sensible. I mean, black is trying to expand on the queen side, which he does in an awful lot of variations anyway. And this is just a slightly different way of doing it. And black waits to see how he's going to commit his queenside pieces. I mean, often when he puts a bishop on b7, then white plays d4 and d5, or we saw in other positions, plays d3. So there's that. If he brings the bishop the other way, then white can respond in another way. So it's flexible. He's waiting to see how white responds after d4, a4, bishop c2. Well, okay, bishop to d7. So it's, here there's clearly no point in bishop to b7, then d5 would be fine. So bishop to d7, and now white starts on the usual knight trip. Black makes his prophylactic moves. And this is, and by the way, those last two moves are sometimes played the other way around for black. All right, so this is, again, kind of a strange position, or at least an unusual position, but black is going to play knight a5, and then it all kind of makes sense. Like if he plays knight c4, white won't be able to play b3 because AB hangs the rook on a1. So this variation has been is interesting enough that some great players like Carlsen, Nakamura, and Ponomarev have all given it a try. And there's a pretty strong GM, it's about 2600, named Stevich, and he's played this a bunch of times with reasonable results. Anyway, what I would recommend for white here is bishop to e3, knight a5, and now b3. So we prevent the knight from jumping in on c4. Okay, AB, wait, just trying to think. Yeah, I mean, white can't play b3 here, obviously, but what I said before about knight a5, of course, then he can. Anyway, bishop b3, knight a5, b3, takes, c5, d5. And in my view, white has to be slightly better here because the knight on a5 is misplaced. This is a very, very typical Ruy Lopez problem for black, this knight on a5. What does he do? Because if he plays knight to b7, whenever you see that and you're white, if you can do it safely, there's nothing better for you, or there's no clear problem with it, play b4. Because when you play b4, and then you make sure you keep it on b4, you're not going to play b takes c5, but you keep the pawn on b4 so that the knight on b7 is just horrible. I mean, it's got to go to d8, but even when it goes to d8, it's got nothing. So then someday it's got to go to f7, and even f7 is not a very good square. So you can see it's really not a well-placed piece. So black is not going to be in any hurry to drop the knight back to b7. He's going to wait for white, because if white plays b4 here, then of course knight c4 is going to happen. Anyway, that's a bit of where the battle lies. I mean, it's going to be a maneuvering game from here, but I think white probably stands a little bit better. All right, finally, after instead of a5, after h3, one last move we'll look at now is queen to d7. We'll only discuss this momentarily. So it's another funny-looking move, but the idea, it's again kind of, it's based on the reasoning that ruled the Zaitsev out for many years. Black wants to play rook to e8, but is afraid of knight to g5. Well, by playing queen d7, now you can meet knight to g5 after rook e8 by playing the knight back to d8, and thus covering it. And the knight can sometimes then go to e6, where it would hit a knight on g5, it would block the bishop on b3's diagonal to f7, and maybe at some point it could go to f4 or c5 or pressure d4, depending on what white has done in the meantime. Anyway, from here, white can either play a d3 setup, trying to take advantage of the inevitable bishop to b7, or just play classically and go forward with d4, knight b to d2, and so on. So I don't really want to say anything more about this system, but it's an interesting one. I think Karpov played this as well, at least once, against Kasparov, although I think he ended up losing that game. Anyway, that, I think, finishes the job. So I was originally not planning to discuss most of what I did discuss in this video, but I thought, all right, after 30 shows, I mean, I should be thorough and not rush at the end and make sure that some other important moves were covered too. Even if they're not as important as the absolute main lines, still, these are significant alternative tries, most of them, and at least deserved a few words said on their behalf. But so from here on out, we're sticking to the main moves, the Chigorin, the Zaitsev, the Breyer, and that'll be it. So hope you're enjoying this series. If not, well, good news, it's almost over. And, well, it's almost over whether you are or not, but I hope you are. Anyway, see you next time. Bye-bye.